Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. So, throughout the last several episodes, we've been talking a lot about the spiritualist movement of the 19th century and how its impact has influenced various movements and has shaped our world to this day. But on this episode, I'm going to discuss some of the tools that a lot of these spiritualists or mystics or whatever have used and will still use to this very day in order to, divine the future, see into the past, speak with the dead, whatever goal you're trying to accomplish through your seance or whatever. And I'm going to start with a subject that has been requested before, but I really didn't have the resources to turn it into a standalone episode, so it's here. And this subject is tarot cards, tarot decks, and a little bit of what they are and their history. So most people are familiar with a tarot deck or what a tarot deck is. It's simply a deck of cards, and generally they can range from anywhere from 24 up to 98 cards. However, most decks tend to have around, 78 cards. And despite popular belief that these cards are associated with witches or wizards or psychics or mystics or whatever, they actually have a very mundane starting point. They started out as basic playing cards and nothing more. The earliest decks of these playing cards seem to arrive in Italy sometime in the 1300s, and a lot of people believe they were based on 11th century playing cards which had taken off in Asia and were introduced to Europe through trade lines. But that's essentially what they are. They're just playing cards. They're no different than a deck of cards you would find in a casino or in your junk drawer right now. And these early cards actually created a lot of the standards for the modern playing card. We see the earliest incarnations of the suit symbols and the court cards, and they were used to play games. And let's be honest, during this time, playing card games meant that they were being used for gambling, because why the hell not? What else do you have to do? It's also around this time when we see an introduction of cheap paper. That's the best way I can put it, to Europe, and it creates this explosion of playing cards and card games. And one very popular card game was known as Tarocchini, or I guess if you want to get really Italian sounding, Tarocchini. And that game gives us the modern root, tarot, which goes on to be a tarot deck. Now, Tarocchini, I'm going to keep saying it like that because it's funny. That game actually has nothing to do with divination. While looking up this game on Wikipedia, it seems like a cross between what we call modern day gin rummy and euchre. And it was a very popular game that used this style of card deck. And in fact, this style of card deck was the standard across Europe up until about the 18th century, mostly in non-English speaking countries. And it's really in countries where these games aren't widely played and where these particular types of card decks aren't popular is where we start to get the first introduction of them being used in what's called cartomancy. And cartomancy is, very simply put, fortune telling or divination using a set of playing cards. If you recall from that mess of an episode back in season 2 on divination, kind of has roots in this. So cartomancy really rises in popularity in the late 18th century, ironically during the Age of Enlightenment, go figure. And it can actually be traced back to a single Frenchman, a man named Antoine de Gablyon, who was a French clergyman who wrote that after seeing a group of women playing cards, he had this idea that tarot wasn't merely a game of cards, but was in fact an ancient Egyptian type of Kabbalic kind of game, or had some kind of mystic origin in that. Probably because he saw the artwork on these cards and these weird symbols that he didn't understand, and he thought, hey, Freemasonry's really popular, maybe I'll link it to that. So Court de Gablyon, he writes this long kind of thesis based on this idea that these things are of Egyptian mystic origin, and it becomes very popular. And then that leads to further people beginning to speculate on the origins and meanings behind these cards. So that leads us to Juan Baptiste Alliette, or Etilia, as he apparently wanted to be known. He was the first one to assign divinatory meanings to tarot decks. and he did this in 1783. And he goes on to write various books and treatises on tarot and divination, and he creates the first society for tarot cartomancy. And he's really one of these early pushers who makes it extremely popular in France. And it remains popular in France for a very long time. And then further French occultists go on to kind of build upon these earlier works. And after a while, the whole idea of cartomancy becomes fairly uniform. Now the specific meanings of each card are pretty much set in stone for the most part. And a lot of it is attributed to this guy named Levi, who kind of is the father of the idea of like the major and minor arcana and stuff like that. And this takes us into that time of kind of the 1870s, 1880s, when all these kind of occult groups start popping up around France and Germany and England, like the French Theosophical Society and the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross. And most famously outside of France, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which you might remember from my Aleister Crowley episode. You know, he was kind of the guy who spoiled all the fun for everybody when he decides to exploit a schism amongst the group leaders in order to become one of those group leaders through this coup attempt. And then everybody afterward is like, you know what, I'm out. However, early on in the Golden Dawn, back in 1886, the founding three members, they started publishing these papers and treatises and books on tarot, and they really popularize it in England. And they go on to kind of create their own interpretation of the tarot and their own rules regarding the divination and occult practices around tarot. And a lot of modern decks that are used in the 20th century are kind of based on this Golden Dawn kind of idea. Now, the Golden Dawn never produced their own deck when they were in existence, but most modern decks that we see today kind of use their rules and interpretations as kind of a guide, mostly in England and here in the United States. A lot of modern decks kind of follow the same format because it's mostly easy to learn. And tarot is also kind of a latecomer to the United States. The earliest accounts we see in the United States comes from a book entitled Fortune Telling by Cards or Cartomancy Made Easy, published in 1872. However, outside of a few like little secret societies and stuff, it really doesn't take off in America until the latter half of the 20th century. And it was during that new age kind of hippie movement of the 60s when we really start to see an explosion in the use of tarot and tarot via divination and cartomancy here in the good old United States. Because all these people who were into that new age mysticism stuff, like all that hippie stuff, they were the ones who brought it out of the realm of the esoteric into the realm of the mainstream. And then naturally it starts to show up in films and in all the little divination shops that you go to read your future or whatever. The cards rise in popularity, they're sold in stores across the country, and like angsty teenage witches and goths, they flock to that stuff because it's just awesome. And despite their hatred by, ultra-conservative Christians who push that satanic panic garbage, it becomes fairly popular and it's seen as a way to like divine the future or whatever. And that's the most common use for it that we see, at least in the mainstream. They're using it to divine the future, find out if they're going to be fortunate or if they're going to die or I don't know, whatever. However, divining the future really isn't the purpose of a tarot deck. When you really dive into what cartomancers are actually doing with tarot decks, they're basically seeking personal guidance for spiritual growth. They're using them on their spiritual journey, their spiritual path. Because at least in like the major arcana, which is something I've been reading about, it goes on this idea of the fool's journey. You draw a card and that card is supposed to represent like where you are on the spiritual path and where you need to head to on your spiritual path. And other cards will influence various variables around that spiritual path. It's about seeking growth along that journey and bettering yourself as, I guess, a person. However, if somebody does take it out and they want to be like, okay, am I going to be rich in the future? There's no rule against that. Because at the end of the day, they're just a mundane deck of playing cards. You can literally make up whatever you want. During the use of them, you can make up your own rules. And usually tasks like that exercise the brain and can create some positive psychological impacts. Say you're going through a tough time and you pull your deck out and it tells you that everything's going to be okay. That can lead to a positive impact on the brain. And then it might shift you out of that focus of, oh, everything sucks, everything's terrible, woe is me. So in some ways, it's a psychological tool. It can reinforce some things or change your mindset. However, the tarot doesn't really help you in their spiritualist journey of communicating with the dead. However, there is another device out there that was used during the height of spiritualism, still used today, that allows you to speak to the dead, and that is the infamous Ouija board. Now, Ouija boards developed as a fairly modern trend out of an older kind of divination, or in some cases a necromantic practice known as automatic writing or psychography. Now, simply put, automatic writing is just you're sitting there and you kind of just like go blank into a trance. You're holding some kind of writing utensil or a planchette, and you're allowing the spirit world to guide your hand. And it's actually a very old practice. It dates back to Chinese practices as far back as 1100 AD. And these monks or priests, they would use this practice in order to receive messages from various deities or their ancestors who were essentially watching over them from the spirit realm. Now, in Europe, it hits Europe in about the 16th century. And we would see accounts of it throughout the next 3 centuries, but it really does take off during that rise in spiritualism in the latter half of the 19th century, and it's still practiced to this day. So here in the United States, the spiritualist movement really takes off after the American Civil War, or as those in the South call it, the War of Northern Aggression. And psychic mediums at this time were popping up on like every street corner because they realized that all these grieving people not having closure because their sons died far away on some battlefield would pay a lot of money to be able to communicate with those deceased relatives just one last time. However, it wasn't completely rife with frauds. A lot of people, I'd say probably 90% of spiritualists, really actually did believe in this stuff. But you know how it is. There's always that minority group, that like 10% or whatever, who are just out there to defraud people, who basically ruin it for everybody. And then they give the whole movement a bad name. So post-Civil War, it's the 1860s, early 1870s, you have these grieving families and they might go into one of these parlors, or they might invite the local psychic to their house or whatever, and then they would hold a seance. And during the course of this seance, Madame whatever, insert French name here, because they always seem to be like some Creole French name. You know, she's the psychic who's leading the seance, and she'll go into a trance, and then she'll start this automatic writing process a lot of the time. And usually that would scrawl out whatever message was coming from whatever entity they were looking to communicate with, obviously. However, automatic writing wasn't always trusted, so others started using the introduction of spirit boards, and that's just like a modern Ouija board. It's a board about the size of, I don't know, your cutting board in your kitchen. It's got the letters on it and the yes and no and the numbers, you know, and you use a planchette in order to communicate with the spirit. And these gained widespread popularity. And it's actually here in Ohio where they really take off in popularity, because Ohio was home to a bunch of these spiritualist like camps, like you go out to like a weekend camp or a day camp or whatever. And they said that in like every one of those camps, they were using the spirit boards. They were just so popular. They're like the number one tool used by spiritualists and mediums at the time. So naturally, this being America and this being a popular fad, people decided to cash in. So it's around this time when these businessmen, one named Elijah Bond and another named Charles Kennard, they decide, hey, let's market and sell these things. And they don't really sell it as a spiritual device, they sell it as a parlor game. It's like the latest new board game. It will allow you to, I don't know, communicate with spirits of the other realm. Check it out. But they needed a catchy name for it. They couldn't just call it a spirit board. So the story behind the catchy new name actually comes from a seance which took place in Baltimore. During this seance, they asked the board what it would like to be called, and it spelled out Ouija. And they said that it was this ancient Egyptian word meaning good luck, even though that's not true at all. What most likely actually happened was, so there was this popular, I guess, French novelist, and her last name was Ouida, Ouida. And I guess one of the guys wanted to like kind of push it so it spelled that out, and that would be the name, and it would kind of cash in on this already popular author. However, during this seance, the J ends up being selected as opposed to the D, and that becomes the brand name Ouija. And that remains the iconic name up until this day, most likely due to a mistake from one of the creators wanting to name the board after one of his favorite novelists. And the reason these guys are able to sell these boards like this as a new game that they created is because they were able to secure a patent on Ouija boards or spirit boards. Now, originally their patents were rejected because they were like, no, you can't patent this. It's already been created. You know, you don't own this. But then they create the iconic version of what we see today, those two arches with the letters and the numbers and the like goodbye and little symbols and stuff. And it's changed just enough that they're able to secure a patent and they're able to mass produce and sell these things, and it kicks off this fad. Of course, then afterwards, this other guy, he takes over the company and he claims that he created it himself, and Ouija is oui and ja, French oui, and ja, German, and it means yes. But it's like, dude, we know you're just making that up. Like, go screw yourself. And I felt like I needed to throw all of that in there because that all gets kind of mixed up into the history of Ouija boards. However, under this new guy, they steadily become more and more popular, and then they reach kind of a peak in the 1920s, and that's because, you know, it's the 1920s. So what's going on in the 1920s? Well, first, there's a huge resurgence in spiritualism, especially in Europe, because they just went through the most devastating war of all time, World War I, where literally millions of people were just killed for no other reason than some jackasses drawing lines on a map. Couple that with the Spanish flu pandemic, which happened just 1 year later, and spiritualism is all the rage again. And in the United States, there's kind of this freewheeling attitude of, you know, people indulging in the latest fads and fashions. And the 1920s is filled with various fads and fashions. There's the flappers, the jazz age, it's prohibition, so cocktails become very popular. And like, I don't know, flagpole sitting and tinkering with radios. And another thing that becomes very popular is Ouija. However, the Ouija board remains a popular board game to this very day. Eventually, Hasbro gets a hold of it, and they release new ones every year. However, not everyone sees Ouija boards as an innocent little game. Most Christians strongly feel that Ouija boards are satanic, that when you are speaking to these spirits or whatever, you are contacting basically Satan or some other demon. Now, this actually comes from some biblical text which warns against any sort of divination or magic practices. Basically, divination and magical practices are an offense to God in their religion. Of course, the most scathing backlash came after the exorcism of Ronald Doe, which I discussed back in Season 2. Terrible sound quality, but it's a good story. But just to hit the base points, Ronald Doe, he was this kid, he was really attached to his aunt, and him and his aunt used to play with a Ouija board. Well, she dies, and then shortly after that, he becomes possessed by some kind of demon. And he's possessed to the point where they have to have a series of exorcisms. And he survives these exorcisms. He actually goes on to work for NASA later in life. However, his story becomes the inspiration for the film The Exorcist. Now, the hypothesis with Ronald Doe was that through using the spirit board, he was communicating with a demon. And that's because spirit boards are seen to be not really telephones, but more like oracles. So the basis behind the spirit board is basically the fact that it's open to any entity on the other side in that spirit realm that wishes to communicate. And it creates kind of like a portal, and that entity can come through and communicate. Now, it's not like a telephone system where it's point to point. You dial in a number and you get that specific person. Ouija boards are more like party lines where it's open to basically anything on that other side, and you simply don't know whom or what you're going to receive. And in the case of Ronald Doe, when he was using the spirit board in order to basically contact his late aunt, it said that he contacted a demon instead and allowed that demon to come through. And it's in this post-1970s exorcist world when spirit boards become the iconic tool for like everything satanic or everything paranormal. You want to talk to a ghost? Use a Ouija board. Want to talk to a demon? Use a Ouija board. Want to summon a demon to come and possess you? Use Ouija board. Now, that's the spiritual beliefs when it comes to Ouija boards. They started out as somewhat innocent spiritual beliefs. It's like, okay, it's a way I can communicate with my dead relative. But then it gets a little more sinister, especially after the church gets involved. Of course, there's a backlash against that too, because since they remain so popular, they show up in our media, or like ghost films and whatever. However, scientifically, we know that Ouija boards are primarily influenced by the ideomotor effect. That's the way I say it. I know I'm saying it wrong, but that's just how my mouth works. Now, the ideomotor effect comes from these little micro movements that we're not aware that we're actually performing when holding on to the little planchette. And these little micro movements can make the planchette feel like it's moving on its own. And this isn't a new idea. This actually goes back to 1853 when Michael Faraday first described it while he was investigating table turning. And table turning is another spiritualist practice found in seances. It's also known as table tilting or table tapping. And the iconic table is probably the oldest spiritualist tool or device out there, because every time you do a seance or have any of this spiritualist type stuff, you're usually doing it on a table or around a table. So in the earliest days of spiritualism, the early 1850s, the most popular method of consulting with spirits was for several persons to sit around a table with their hands resting upon it, and they would wait for the table to move. And if successful, if a spirit had come forth, the table would tilt in a certain direction, or it would lift up off the ground, or it would rotate. And all of these movements and rotations and stuff would be interpreted by the lady leading the seance, who would have come up with her own method of interpreting this stuff. And of course, people being people and capitalism being capitalism, there were a lot of frauds out there who were debunked because they would have tables that were designed to move on their own or do whatever. But even in these early days, there were scientific-minded folk out there who wanted to study this, so they would observe these seances, and that's where the ideomotor effect is first observed. And it's a phenomenon that's still kind of played around with till this day. However, we can't discuss a seance without the iconic centerpiece of everybody's table, the infamous crystal ball. Now, what is a crystal ball and what is it used for? Now, a crystal ball, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's a sphere made out of quartz or glass. It's a little bit bigger than a baseball. And they actually date back to Rome in around the 5th century AD. They were very popular. And they're primarily used for divination or the art of scrying. And it's very simple. The psychic or the medium or whatever will stare into the crystal ball. And while staring into this ball, they'll put themselves into kind of a hypnotic trance. It's a trick that the brain performs on our eyes, basically. It's essentially described as a focus state which reduces mental clutter and enables the emergence of visual images. Of course, the problem with scrying is it's not codified. There's no set of rules for it. It's all up to the interpretation of the person doing the scrying, the person looking into the crystal ball. Of course, scrying isn't just used in crystal balls. It can be used in pretty much any medium. Hell, modern people do it with their smartphones. You can look into hot coals, pitch blackness, the bottom of lakes. A lot of people used to do it with mirrors and bowls of water. But essentially what you're doing is you're getting your mind into this relaxed state, and when that happens, you start to hallucinate. And this is true. It's kind of why that Bloody Mary trick works. It's also why if you stare into a mirror long enough, your brain will actually get bored and start to distort figures around you. But it's believed that once your mind hits that state, that's when you're receiving that message from the powers that be or the spirit realm or the gods or whatever. Most of the time it's used in prediction of the future, fortune telling, and it's practiced by cultures all over the world. And fortune telling seems to be what crystal balls are mostly affiliated with. It's that iconic stereotypical image of the old gypsy lady who tells you your future by staring into the crystal ball. Of course, just from what I've personally seen in life, you have to listen to those old gypsy ladies because they're usually right. You never go against what the old gypsy lady says, but I digress. But what we see with the iconic crystal ball is it's mostly a prop. It's there to give a sense of theater for the most part. We don't really see a ton of historic accounts where they're used in spiritualist practices. They seem to be a more modern thing, a more 20th century thing. However, it's kind of one of those things that's like spiritualist adjacent. It's kind of an ancient practice that kind of gets lumped into that whole stereotype of spiritualism, mediums, old gypsy ladies, etc., etc. Of course, when it comes to fortune telling, that can open up a whole list of rabbit holes that's probably better off in the future. Let's bring it back around to spiritualism. One little phenomenon that is now debunked really took off in the late 19th century because of the rise of photography. It was called spirit photography or ghost photography. And this little phenomenon really contributed to the popularity of the spiritualist movement post-Civil War, partly because at this time, the 1860s, photography is still a fairly new technology that very few people understand. I mean, at this point, photography is still in its infancy. It's probably 20, 30 years old. And for this, we really have to look at the early history of photography. So the first type of photography was the daguerreotype process. And since this and other very early processes led to long exposure times, any kind of passing movement could possibly leave a faint, almost ghostly-like image. And in 1856, a man named Sir David Brewster recognized that these effects could be used deliberately to create ghostly pictures. And at this time, he probably just sees it as an interesting thing or a form of entertainment. He probably doesn't think that it's going to lead to an uprise in ghost photography and people thinking this stuff was actually their dead relatives, but it gets crazy. So that's fun for a while, but then a couple years later in 1859, it really takes off hard because at this point we have the glass plate negative process, and this process made it practical to reuse exposure plates, and it allowed for previous images to remain visible on future images. And it was kind of discovered by accident, but it leads to these entrepreneurial folks thinking, oh my god, I can make a lot of money off of this. Now, a really early famous entrepreneur in this was a man named William Mumler, who in 1862 published a photograph of what was purportedly the spirit of his cousin who had died 12 years earlier. Now, he discovers this through a double exposure process where he was reusing plates that were improperly cleaned. But essentially through this mistake and this discovery and the publication of this photo, he becomes very famous and he starts a successful business as a, quote, spirit photographic medium. So he begins setting up in New York and Boston, and he's specializing in servicing those hoping to find a supernatural connection with their relatives killed in the ongoing Civil War. Now, one of Mumler's most famous images is the photograph of Mary Todd Lincoln posed with the purported spirit of Abraham standing behind her. But his fraud was found out because these plates that he was using, these ones that were like being used to create the ghostly image, they were used from actual people who were still alive who was photographed by him. And these clients were still living, and when everybody found out about his deception, he was put on trial and charged with fraud. And even P.T. Barnum, a larger-than-life man who I definitely need to do an episode on, testified against him in this trial and stated that he was taking advantage of people's grief. Because I guess according to P.T. Barnum, it was okay to take advantage of people's ignorance, but it wasn't okay to take advantage of people's grief. But even though his fraud was exposed in 1869 and people were catching on to the fact that spirit photography was basically just a camera trick, people still believed in it, and to be honest, they still believe in it till this day. Now, it does fall out of popularity in the 1920s when Harry Houdini really goes hard on debunking this stuff. That's a future episode too. At least it is at the time of recording. It might be a past episode now. I'm recording these out of order, so I don't know. Either way, if that Houdini episode's up, go listen to it. It's awesome. But the traditional spirit photography, that camera trick, really falls out of fashion in the 1920s. Now, modern spirit photography is kind of different because you're deliberately snapping photos in order to spot a ghost or whatever other paranormal entity you're looking for. Let's just be honest, it's ghosts. We know it's ghosts. And it has its zealots and critics as well. And a big popular thing amongst that is orbs. People think orbs in photographs are ghosts or spirits or demons or whatever. However, I'll be honest, 9 times out of 10, an orb is a dust particle or something reflecting from the flash of the camera. Or in the case of orbs in cemeteries, you're usually photographing fireflies. However, orbs aren't the only thing. We also have images of apparitions or people who weren't there when the photograph was taken. There is that famous photo from the Myrtles of the woman standing near the house and she's wearing like a turban, and the people who took that photo know for a fact that that human was not standing there at the time of that photo being taken. We also see photos of like shadowy figures and possible photos of apparitions. And to be honest, those ones, they're harder to say either way what's going on there. Now, a large criticism I get from this show is that I go out to debunk things. Personally, I don't go out to debunk anything. I try to tell both sides of the story and keep an open mind. Now, I admit, sometimes I do allow my personal biases to kick in, but it's my show, I can do what I want. But I'll be honest, for me personally, when it comes to this stuff, spirit boards and seances and spirit photography, I want that stuff to be true. Or at the very least, partially true, or just unable to be debunked. Because at the end of the day, no, I'm not religious, but I do believe in ghosts, the spirit world. I believe that there's something else out there. And if we can find some kind of scientific way to prove that, that would be awesome. I would love that. That's why I like to divulge in these topics of the spooky, the macabre, and the, esoteric side of life. And as most listeners probably know, I've said this in the past, I don't really cover a lot of ghost stories, paranormal stuff on this show because, for one, they're already out there and there are a lot of people who can tell them a lot better than I can. And secondly, there are a few of those stories out there where I know if I go digging into it and looking into the history and all that stuff, I am going to accidentally debunk it. And that kind of spoils a little bit of the fun for myself, personally. And I guess this little mini-series of episodes divulging into the occult and spiritualism and ghosts and all that stuff I've been doing over the past few episodes is my way of kind of making up for skipping out on a lot of ghost lore in previous seasons that people have been asking for. And looking to the future, I'll probably focus more on some of this stuff because it seems to be a little more popular, a little more engaging. But speaking of the future, it's not all ghost stories this season. I do have a ton of other stuff I want to dig into. So for those out there who are worried, this season's also going to include some of our classic Cold War stuff, something huge that I've been planning since literally day one of this podcast. And of course, I will have to take an episode or two to talk about some cryptids. I haven't done a cryptid episode in a while. To be honest, the episode about the Mothman was the last big cryptid episode I did, and that was a very long time ago, so I need to get on it. And speaking of that, this is where I'm going to end it. So as always, this is Mike. I thank you for listening. Go follow it on Spotify. Give it those 5 stars. That helps out the most. follow it on the other platforms as well. You can always engage on Instagram and Threads. It's Urban Legends and Mythology at Instagram and Threads. At the time of recording, I have started kind of playing around with Reels. I don't really care much for Reels, but it's an engagement, so let's see where that goes. So I guess if you have any questions about anything, I might do it there. So Instagram Reels, I'm there. By the time this episode launches, I'll probably have several of them up. I don't know, maybe we can do some like super mini 1-minute episodes about cryptids or something. I don't know. I'll figure it out. Also, as always, yes, I'm a broken record. Please donate to that link in the description of every episode. That really helps out a lot. You guys who are already doing that are the true rock stars. And if you don't want to do any of that for whatever reason, I get it, life's hard, at least do me a solid. Tell your friend at work, hey, I'm listening to this cool podcast, you should check it out. Word of mouth is truly how this show grows, and you guys have no idea the impact that has on this show. That's why it's in 58 countries right now. Finally broke into Russia, which is a country I've been trying to get on my little country list forever, so that's awesome, and I thank you people who made that happen. But I'm rambling now. Once again, thank you for everything. I'll see you in the next episode.